Somewhere, deep in the shroud between tomorrow and nowhere, a rock slowly splits with a crawling murmur. A burst of dust and debris whips up behind you and pours into the stone, carving a deep door with a lintel of teeth. You smell something lost to your memory that draws you within. As you trip the threshold, your feet fester in fetid night milk, and in your panic you turn back to see naught but a slick, bloody reflection of the UMBRAL Zone. Every story of modern Eorzea seems to pivot around Dalamud as a catalyst for tragedy. The UMBRAL era is not only a physical phenomenon, it is a climate of despair. Every Machiavelli of the Void reaches out to weakened wills, seizing opportunities for which they have bided centuries. These opportunities do not only come in forms of violence and ambition. Predators of the Void feed as much on loneliness, anxiety, and vanity. The horrors of Haukke Manor and the crimes of Lady Amandine d'Artencourt were not entirely of her own conception. Still, it took but a small push from masked strangers to send her toppling. All the same, we know precious little of this story outside of euphemism. Amandine, like so many monsters of Eorzea, was twisted by the suffering of a very human weakness, and for that, she has an ons of our sympathy. It helps that we bore no witness to her crimes, only their comparatively tame aftermath, but perhaps you will feel appropriately more rattled once I show you that Lady Amandine is real, or at least a near-perfect reflection of a very real woman. Her name was Countess Barter Erzsébet, romanized as Elizabeth Barter, and she was credited by some sources with the murders of some 650 young women around the turn of the 17th century in Hungary. Barter's forefathers were voivodes of Transylvania, neighbors and allies in war with that infamous Wallachian prince, Vlad Dracul. She was born into nobility, surrounded by lords, dukes, and kings, highly educated, fluent in Latin, Greek, and German, presumably wanting for naught. But birth and influence have never mitigated suffering. As a child, she bore witness many times to her father and his officers torturing local peasants, including one instance where a captured thief was sewn alive into the stomach of a dying horse. At 10 years of age, she was engaged to Count Ferenc Nadasdy and took up residence in his home of Castle Savar to the west. She spent most of her time here alone, as the Count was often abroad at war with the Ottoman Empire, and within a few years she fell pregnant to a servant of the castle. Ferenc had the young man brutally castrated and quite literally thrown to the dogs, spirited the young Elizabeth away to give birth in secret to a daughter who was dissociated with the family and quite probably killed. Shortly after this ordeal, the pair were wed and moved to another castle overlooking the village of Cheta, where Elizabeth was charged with the administration and defense of her husband's estates. Nadasdy was appointed commander of a flank of the Hungarian army in 1578, when Elizabeth was 18 years old, and he quickly earned a reputation both as a courageous fighter and a vicious torturer and butcher of Ottoman prisoners, erecting the same kind of public displays of corpses as the aforementioned Vlad the Impaler. But his own penchant for cruelty was already second to the visceral imagination of his wife. Servants of the household later attested that Elizabeth tutored the Count on techniques of physical torture that she had developed with the unwilling assistance of castle workers and young women from the local village, and in return he had built for her a grand and elaborate dungeon of dark iron and nightmare fuel. The Ottoman threat held the complete attention of the Hungarian nobility, and these deviations would be kept perfectly secret for several decades, as the private life of the Countess Barter remained very private indeed, and the curiously high turnover of staff at the Cheta castle slowly and gradually escalated. The Count and Countess eventually conceived 5 children of their own, 3 of which survived childhood and were sent to live with various relatives, leaving their mother to pursue her hobbies in peace. Ferenc died in 1604 on the battlefront from an illness that had taken from him the use of his legs over the preceding few years. He entrusted his heirs and widow to a man named George Thurzo, who would soon prove instrumental in the investigations made against the Countess. It was during this time that the rumors began to spread, complaints made in Vienna still largely ignored until 1610, when finally conceding the number of young noblewomen that had entered the trust of Barter never to be seen again, the Holy Roman Emperor and King of Hungary Matthias II assigned Thurzo to formally investigate. Notaries of his took witness accounts of unbelievable rituals. The victims, almost exclusively young women, had been subjected to the most incredible and creative sadism. The spectacles that the Countess had reportedly delighted in over the 30-something year period included pushing pins and needles under the fingernails of victims, tying them down covered with honey to be attacked by bees and ants, consuming pieces of flesh from their bodies and faces before their very eyes, even forcing them to cook and eat their own breasts, cutting and peeling at their faces with red-hot irons, keys, coins, nails. Many were slowly starved, mutilated, burned, and beaten to death over a period of some weeks, or sometimes frozen to death. Each of these acts were confirmed by former workers of the household, or by villagers that had discovered the mutilated corpses in shallow mass graves around each of her several properties. The legend that she had regularly bathed in the blood of her virginal victims as a method for retaining her youth and vitality were conflated from these, but truly do not seem much of a stretch. Thurzo reported that upon moving to arrest her, he caught the Countess in the very midst of one of these rituals, with one girl present dead, another dying, and several others chained up, malnourished, and severely mutilated. 4 servants of the castle were accused as accomplices in both the acquisition and torture of victims, and 3 of them were executed with little ceremony. Barter, on the other hand, stood trial before a royal supreme court and some few dozen judges, with hundreds of witnesses brought forth from amongst the staff and surrounding villages of the Barter holdings. It seemed that each of her confidants, accomplices, and witnesses only had a very narrow idea of the scope of her crimes, each reporting knowledge to somewhere between a few dozen and a few hundred murders. Servants of the castle Savar alone noticed a few hundred cadavers being removed from the castle before the trial. But the number that has been generally accepted by historians was cited by one servant at Cheta that had claimed to find the personal diaries of the Countess, which recorded and detailed with relish the deaths of a total of 650 young women, peasant and noble alike. Rather than being herself executed, the Countess was condemned to solitary confinement in her chambers at Cheta. Her windows and doors bricked off entirely save for a small slit through which mills could be passed. And here she stalked in the darkness for 4 years before dying quietly and naturally at 54. It is hardly surprising that this woman became a fixation of many writers through the 18th and 19th centuries, whom particularly perpetuated the legend of her literal bloodbaths and supposed vampirism, giving her epithets such as the Blood Countess, the Bloody Lady, and Countess Dracula. And so it is with little exaggeration that this Gothic archetype of the Blood Countess survived to its latest expression, our own Lady Amandine. The universes of Final Fantasy are an ever-cycling morality tale, warding against pride, hubris, and ambition, and Amandine's tale makes another beautiful and tragic installment. A widowed Duskwight of wealthy standing and renowned beauty, she seized that which the Pajal had learned to abandon. This Haukke Manor is a symbol of the spark of Amdapori arrogance and vanity which survived the humbling trials of the Gelmoran Dark, and Amandine, full of the blood of her condemned ancestors, evidently found the debt yet unpaid. She purchased the manor and proceeded to live in decadence. The shard of Dalamud which landed upon the northwest shroud spat at her in contempt. Some splash of fire or shrapnel left her disfigured and traumatized, and it took little coercion for her to gladly pay it forward. After pursuing countless exotic tinctures and treatments that might restore her former luster to no avail, the Ascians saw a chance to mine such a well of blood that could summon a great host of Voidsent to terrorize the shroud. Ursandel, former butler of the house, confessed to the escalation of his lady's obsession. As he put it, she began receiving queer guests. None among us knew whence they came, these masked men, but my lady believed that they would help her to regain that which she had lost. So began the rites of rejuvenation. These rituals seemed innocent enough in the beginning, but grew ever more grotesque as time went by. Eventually, there came a day when my lady bound one of her handmaidens to her bed and proceeded to mutilate the poor girl's face. Suffice it to say, she did not survive the ordeal. It fell to me to dispose of her body. I performed the dreadful task as bade, obedient servant that I was. But when the time came to return to the house, my legs refused to move. I knew then that I could not go back to that place, not after the nightmare I had witnessed. Once it was suggested to her that bathing in the blood of beautiful young maidens might prove just the remedy she was looking for, Lady Amandine went full battery. She quickly exhausted her own maidservants and sent for more to be lured and entrapped from Gridania, and she allowed her own essence to be corrupted and infused with the blood rituals she was enabling, sapping her humanity and transforming herself into a Voidsent succubus. A group of young scions purged the manor, observing that every corpse had blossomed into a demonic host, and striking Amandine down in her chambers. Confirming the presence of La Habrea's minions, they warily proceeded to warn each of the nations of the steadily increasing Ascian activity in the realm, and thought for a long time the job to be done. The wood whalers later moved in to confirm the kill and clean up the fetid and visceral mess left strewn across the house, but the fresh corpses had already begotten fresh Voidsent, and this contingent scream soon echoed across the shroud. It fell once again to the Warriors of Light to investigate, and they found that the blood-soaked halls were not so willing to lie quiet. Perhaps they never will. Amandine herself, after plunging into the void following her first defeat, was gripped and enthralled by a greater succubus, Halicarnassus. And although they were both smote once again, the ordeal stands as a testament to the viscosity of blood and the strength of the channels it lends to the darkness. Next time you enter a dungeon, do please bring a mop. And next time you stumble into the Umbral Zone, I will be waiting. Thanks so much for watching, and subscribe for more.